Folks,
who is that?
This is the final bit. So we've been here all day. You may have already forgotten what you learned in the first panel or in the second panel, although Ken and Nancy and Jack, they're all outstanding. But you may have forgotten bits and pieces. So Andrew Potter's an interesting guy.
No, just keep talking.
Andrew Potter is a longtime journalist, philosopher. Now he is, I'm delighted to say, he is at the McGill School of Public Policy. Woo. And he is going to be, and is, teaching in the MPP program and is going to be helping in terms of organizing conferences and editing book series and all that kind of good stuff. So I've asked Andrew today to just speak for a few minutes. And we are quite conscious of the fact that he is the last thing between you and a drink. So, and he's a fairly concise fellow anyway, so drink adjusted, he's probably going to be even more concise. But I've asked Andrew to just tie it all up and remind you all what you've heard today, and he's going to give you a few of his pearls of wisdom along the way. So without further ado, Andrew, take it away.
Tie it all up. If Paul Martin's aware that there were two people smarter than him in the room, I'm aware that there's probably 75 people smarter than me in the room. And I'd fully intended to simply make a few snarky, semi-insulting remarks about Chris Reagan and move on. But Bill Watson beat me to it earlier today, so I'm going to have to say something more substantial. If there was one recurring theme, I thought, out of the first two panels in particular, but also throughout the whole day, it was the sort of counterpoint between two pairs of ideas, politics versus policy on the one side, partisanship versus populism, doing pure research or non-ideological research versus having a point of view, and then also the search for common ground versus the occasional virtues of deep disagreement and the creative results that come out of that. And those all kind of map onto one another semi-loosely or more or less loosely. But I was surprised by how optimistic a lot of the talk was about the possibility of finding common ground, about finding, and maybe that's because I'm actually a journalist or I was a journalist for a long time where there was not really much optimism to be found anywhere. But I was struck, and I found myself thinking all day long about two comments that Ken Bosanquist made this morning, which was, the first was, don't let politics drive your policy, which drew a few titters here and there throughout the room. And the second was his remark in response to a question, which was, if you want to change the world, if you want to have impact, join a political party, which kind of knocked me back twice in a row because it kind of was at odds with what I kind of believed about the world. Because when it comes to this counterpoint between politics and policy, I've always believed that in an ideal world, the party was the friction point for that. That was the point where almost the clutch, right, where policy meets the political side of things, and you could activate policy through the party mechanism. But a lot of what's gone on over the past, say, 10, 15 years, not just in Canada but elsewhere, has called that into question, in particular through what they call the permanent campaign. And we observed sort of an amplification of that in the most recently concluded federal campaign, which was the overriding influence of politics driving policy, not the other way around, of polling driving policy, not the way around, of communications driving policy, not the other way around. At least that was my interpretation of what happened, or what was going on. And it led me to wonder, and I was actually surprised at how little discussion there was about the relative health of our institutions and being able to continue to serve as that institutional clutch mechanism between politics and policy. In particular, I was surprised at how little conversation there was about the media and its role in communicating things and amplifying or damping down conversations. And maybe the good news is that the mass media has finally stopped playing the gatekeeper role that it ever did, and we can all move on to a much more direct communicative interaction. That's the hopeful side of things. The unhopeful side of it is that I'm not convinced we're spending enough time paying attention to the health of our institutions and that intersection between the party system, parliament, and the mass media. And so maybe that's just another conference we have to have.
Good.
A second remark that really struck me after Bill was finished burying ecofiscal was his comment in the third panel about not paying enough attention to policy losers. Because I think there's a sense or a feeling a lot of us have that good policy is always positive sum and is always good for everyone. And I think Bill's point was a helpful reminder that even the best policy generates losers, people who are on the wrong side of it. And figuring out how to, if not make them whole, at least, what was the term you used, Bill? Share the burden, right? Is something we haven't thought a lot about, or maybe we don't always pay enough attention to. And it seems to me an especially acute problem in light of the federal election, and another issue that didn't get a lot of talk today, but I think was sitting in the background of a lot of what was going on, was the question of Western alienation and the resentments that have built up out of the recent election campaign. Because if you look at some of the reactions that have come out of Alberta in particular, but also Saskatchewan and other places, people are starting to propose policies that are actually to their financial detriment in order to seal themselves off, firewall them off from Ottawa, stick it to the Liberals or what have you. And what that suggests to me is that there are some losses that are not financial, or that there are some losses that can come from a policy choice that can't be fixed simply by cutting a check to somebody. And insofar as a lot of the resentments around equalization and so on, there's an interesting Leger poll from a few years ago. Asked, it was one of those regular polls, what holds Canada together, right? And 25% say the Charter, 21% say hockey, 18% say, the Mounties or something like that. And then it tails off quite quickly. And on that list, equalization is at 4% of the population thinks that holds Canada together. That's 96% of the population. That's not everybody on the giving side, right? That's people on the receiving side also thinking that equalization's not helping matters. So I think one thing I'm going to try and think a lot more about, and when I write something up about all this, is Bill's point about this, which is how can people be made, if not made whole, at least how can we share the burden in ways that include things other than financial things, such as status, respect, and so on, right? The last one I thought really struck with me all day long was this consistent discrepancy between the short-term thinking of politics and the very, very long time frames in which policy is being dealt with. People talk about years. I think Jack Mintz talked about a paper he wrote 10 years later having some kind of effect. Martha Hall Finley made the absolute important point that all of the heavy lifting policy-wise about marijuana legalization was done in 1972 with the Ledane Commission, right? Like nothing new was written about that since then on the policy side, and it took 50 years. And so someone said at one point, policy is about representing the future to the present. And Nancy Olweller put it very, very, I think, aptly when she said, what we're doing at policy schools is we're creating the future. And that reminded me of a remark my friend Joe Heath, who's a professor at U of T and teaches at the School of Policy there. I asked him once why he taught at policy schools and why he just didn't sit in the philosophy department and think big thoughts. And he said, look, I can write all the papers in the world and nobody reads them, or a few people read them and so on. How can I have an impact in the world? Look, if I teach 30 students every year for 4 years, in 4 years, I've got 120 people out there working in, public services or what have you, who believe what I believe, right? Or who've managed to teach. And he said, this is my real impact, right? Is actually like not the papers I'm writing, but the people I'm teaching. And which leads us to the conclusion, which I'll leave you with, which is that also in this room, as someone pointed out, are all of the students of the Max Bell Public Policy School. and there will be 35 to 40 more next year, and after that, and so on. And so the future is in this room, and that makes me quite happy. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrew. The future is indeed in this room. That brings us to an end. Thank you all very much for showing up. I hope you enjoyed the day as much as I did. If you walk out those doors, I think you will find that there are refreshments for you, and you can buttonhole the people that you would like to talk to, whether they were on a panel or not, and I encourage you to do so. But relax and digest the things that you have heard today, and keep looking at MacSpell's website, because we will have other events like this and of different types every few months. So we hope to see you back in the very near future. Thank you very much, and have a good evening.